The rain had not yet started, but I could smell it coming. That was something people never understood about me. Not the other waitresses who laughed too loudly in the back kitchen. Not the alphas who passed through the great hall without ever once glancing in my direction. Not even Sarah, my only friend in Ironvale's royal household, who said I had the imagination of someone with too much time and too little sleep. But I knew things before they happened. Small things. The way the wind shifted direction 3 minutes before a storm. The way certain wolves grew quiet right before a fight broke out. The way the air in the Alpha King's great hall tasted like copper tonight. Metallic and wrong and full of something I couldn't name. I balanced 4 stone cups on a tray worn smooth by years of use and told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. The Feast of the Blood Moon Accord was the most important political gathering in the last 2 decades. Every pack alpha within 3 territories had been summoned to Ironvale Keep, the seat of King Kale's power, to renew the peace treaties that had kept our world from collapsing into another war. I had heard the older wolves whispering about the last war. Not in words exactly, but in the way they fell silent when certain names were spoken. In the way the scars on Elder Bowen's forearms were never explained. Peace was fragile here. It always had been. And I was just a waitress. My name is Ivy, and I had been working in this keep for 3 years, since I was 22, and had nowhere else to go after my home pack dissolved quietly, like smoke, like something that had never really existed at all. I was not a warrior. I was not a healer or a council member or an Omega with a powerful lineage. I was the girl with the pale blonde braid, who refilled cups without being asked, and moved through rooms the way water moved through cracks. Unnoticed, unhurried, careful not to disturb anything larger than herself. Tonight, the great hall had been transformed. Long tables draped in deep burgundy cloth stretched the length of the room, heavy with roasted meats and bread that smelled of rosemary and fire. Candles thick as my wrist burned in iron chandeliers above us, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The walls were lined with tapestries showing the history of the packs. Battles won, territories claimed, alliances sealed in the old way. It was beautiful, in the way that things built on difficult foundations can be beautiful. Impressive, weighty, a little sad. The Alpha representatives sat at their assigned places with the careful posture of people who were being watched. I recognized some of them. Alpha Drev of the Stoneclaw Pack, broad-shouldered and loud, who always tipped over his cup and never apologized. Lady Vessa of the Ashfin, elegant and cold-eyed, who watched everyone the way a hawk watched a field. And at the center of it all, raised on a dais at the head of the room, sat King Kale. I had seen him before, of course. You could not work in Ironvale Keep for 3 years and remain a stranger to its king. But seeing him was never quite the same as seeing him. And tonight, dressed in the dark ceremonial armor that caught the candlelight like a second skin, his long braided hair pulled back and his jaw set in the hard, still expression he wore like armor over armor. He was impossible to look away from. I looked away. Quickly, the way you look away from something that could see you looking. I moved through the tables, pouring, stepping aside, becoming invisible the way I had trained myself to become. Sarah caught my eye from across the room and mouthed, "You okay?" And I gave her the small nod that meant yes, but something feels wrong, which she understood, because we had developed a whole silent language over 3 years of working side by side. She frowned slightly, then turned back to her table. It was when I reached the far end of the hall, near the eastern archway, that I noticed the boy. He was sitting on the bottom step of the back staircase that led to the upper galleries, the one the servants used, half hidden behind a tapestry of a wolf mid-howl, silver thread gleaming in the dim light. He looked about 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and his father's exact jaw, still soft with youth. He was watching the feast with the particular expression of a child who had been told to stay somewhere and was beginning to deeply resent it. Resigned, restless, bored in the specific way that very intelligent children get bored. I knew who he was. Everyone in the keep did. Prince Caden. King Kale's only son. The child the entire future of the Ironvale bloodline rested on, wrapped in a linen tunic and scowling at a tapestry. I should have walked past. It was not my place to speak to him. I was a waitress. He was the heir to the most powerful alpha territory in the region. The distance between us was not just social, it was structural, woven into the very way this world worked. I set my tray against my hip and crouched down to his level anyway. "You look like someone who has been told to stay put," I said quietly, and also like someone who is very bad at it. He looked at me with sharp eyes, Kale's eyes, that unsettling pale gray blue. And for a moment I thought he would dismiss me. Then something in his expression shifted, the way a door does when the latch gives. "The council meeting was supposed to end an hour ago," he said. "Father said I could join the feast when it ended. But it didn't end, and now I'm stuck here." "Councils never end when they're supposed to," I said. "That's practically the definition of a council." He almost smiled. Almost. "You're a waitress. Observant. You'll make a fine alpha someday." This time he did smile. Small, reluctant, like he was trying not to. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. I knew what it felt like to be waiting in a corner while the world carried on without acknowledging you. I was about to say something else. Something light. Something that would have made him laugh and made the next hour easier to bear, when the copper taste in the air sharpened suddenly into something else entirely. The hall went quiet in that strange, instant way that large groups of people go quiet when something wrong happens. Not a gradual hush, but a single cut, like a candle snuffed. My head came up. My body moved before my mind did, some old instinct firing in a language older than thought. The eastern window, the tall one above the archway, the one that looked out toward the northern ridge, shattered. Glass fell like frozen rain. The candles in the chandeliers swayed and guttered. And then, in the half-second of absolute stillness that followed, I saw the arrows. 3 of them. Coming fast. Coming low. Coming directly toward the staircase where I was crouching. Where Prince Caden sat frozen on the bottom step with his eyes wide, and his small body completely, terrifyingly exposed. I did not think. I moved. I dropped the tray. I covered the distance between us in 2 steps and threw myself over him. Arms around his shoulders, my body curving over his like a shell, my face pressed to the cold stone step as the arrows struck the wall behind us with 3 sounds like fists hitting wood. The tapestry above us swayed. Dust fell from the ceiling. Something warm touched my upper arm. A graze, shallow, barely anything. And I did not move. I did not move. The hall erupted, shouting. The scrape of chairs and the crash of overturned tables. Guards pouring in from every entrance. I stayed where I was. One arm locked around the prince. My other hand pressed flat to the stone. Listening to my own heartbeat, counting out the seconds until I was certain the air had stopped moving. And then I heard footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps that make every other sound in a room fall quiet. I looked up. King Kale was standing above me. His gray-blue eyes, the same eyes as his son, just older and harder and stripped of every softness, were fixed on me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not in 3 years. Not once. He was not angry. He was not cold. He looked like a man who had just seen something he did not know how to name. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it was not. I opened my mouth to say no. "Your Majesty, I'm fine. I'm just a waitress. This is nothing." All the small, self-erasing words I had spent years keeping ready. What came out instead was, "Is he?" Kale's jaw tightened. He looked down at his son, still tucked under my arm, shaking slightly but whole and unharmed. Something moved across the king's face. A crack in something very old and very carefully maintained. Then his eyes came back to mine. And for one single suspended moment, the entire world in that hall ceased to exist outside the space between us. "No," he said quietly. "He is not." The guards closed in around us, the hall filled with voices again, and I slowly sat up, still holding Prince Caden's hand without quite realizing I had taken it, and tried very hard to remember how to breathe. The storm outside finally broke. Rain hit the shattered window in sheets, cold and loud and relentless. I had known it was coming. They did not let me leave. That was the first thing I understood, in the strange, slow minutes after the guards swept through the eastern archway, and the broken window was covered with a heavy wool curtain pulled from somewhere I didn't see. No one said you are being detained, Ivy. No one said anything to me directly, actually, which was perhaps the most disorienting part. They simply moved around me with the efficient choreography of people who had trained for exactly this kind of moment. And somehow, in all of that movement, I ended up standing very still in the center of it, while the world rearranged itself. Caden had been taken immediately. 2 of the king's personal guards, enormous men in dark armor, who I recognized from their posts outside the royal corridor, appeared at his side within seconds of Cale's arrival and lifted the boy gently, but without discussion. Caden looked back at me over the guard's shoulder as they carried him toward the inner staircase, and the expression on his face was one I felt in my sternum. A child trying very hard not to look frightened, and not quite succeeding. I held up one hand, a small wave. It's all right. He disappeared around the corner. Sarah found me about 3 minutes later, threading through the chaos with her dark eyes wide and her braid coming loose at the end. She grabbed my arm, my uninjured arm by pure luck, and pulled me close enough to speak without being overheard. Ivy, your arm. It's a graze. It's nothing. It is absolutely not nothing. There is... She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. Come with me, now, before someone with authority notices you and makes this complicated. I think, I said slowly, looking around at the guards, the overturned chairs, the 3 arrows still embedded in the stone wall like some kind of terrible monument, that someone with authority has already noticed. I was right. The king's head steward, a tall and perpetually unreadable man named Aldrich, appeared at my left elbow with the quiet certainty of someone who had been watching me for longer than I realized. The king requests your presence, he said. Not would like, not asks. Requests, which in Ironvale's language of power meant something closer to requires. Sarah's hand tightened on my arm. I looked at her. She looked at me. In our 3 years of shared silence and signal and small kindnesses, I had never seen her look quite like this. Not frightened, exactly, but careful, in the way people are careful when they understand that something is changing and don't yet know in which direction it will fall. It's all right, I told her. And this time, I was not sure if it was true. Aldrich led me not to the Great Hall's antechamber as I had expected, but up through the inner staircase, the one I had never been permitted to use, and along a corridor lined with dark wood paneling and oil lamps that burned with a steadier, quieter light than the feast candles below. The stone beneath my feet changed from cold flags to something warmer, older, darker. The air smelled of pine resin and something I couldn't quite identify. Something clean and northern, like wind off a ridge before dawn. I had cleaned the outer corridors of this keep for 3 years. I had delivered food to council anteroom doors, and linen to upper floor closets, and carried messages for the housekeeper without ever once crossing into the king's private wing. That boundary had always felt less like a rule and more like a law of nature. The kind of thing you simply did not question, because questioning it would reveal you had been foolish enough to imagine you might. And now I was crossing it, with blood drying on the sleeve of my gray work dress, and my braid half undone and my hands still faintly shaking. I pressed them flat against my thighs and made them stop. Aldrich stopped before a heavy door at the corridor's end, knocked twice, and stepped aside without a word. The door opened from within. The room was a study, large, but not in the showy way of the Great Hall. Its largeness was the largeness of accumulated things, maps spread across a central table and weighted at their corners with stones and compass tools, bookshelves along every wall packed not decoratively, but used, with cracked spines and folded pages and scraps of parchment marking passages. A fire burned in a stone hearth on the left wall, and before it stood two wolves I recognized from the feast. Beta Orin, Kyle's second, a compact and sharp-featured man with gray at his temples, and Captain Neva, the head of the King's Guard, a tall woman whose expression at the best of times gave nothing away, and tonight gave even less. And at the far side of the table, standing with one hand resting on a map and his eyes already on me when I entered, was King Kale. He had removed the ceremonial armor. He wore now a simpler tunic of dark linen, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and somehow this was more unsettling than the armor had been. The armor was a costume. This was the man. "Close the door," he said. Aldrich did. From outside, I stood in the middle of the room with the firelight on the left side of my face, and made myself meet the king's gaze, because looking away felt like something I could not afford right now. "Your arm," he said. The same word Sarah had used, but in a completely different tone, not alarmed but precise, the way someone says a thing when they are cataloging information. "A graze. The arrow barely—" "Neva." The captain moved immediately, appearing at my side with a small kit and a manner that discouraged argument. She examined the cut on my upper arm with efficient, impersonal hands. The graze was shallow, maybe 4 inches long, already clotting. Cleaned it with something that stung briefly and wrapped it in 2 neat strips of linen before I had quite processed that it was happening. "Thank you," I said, because manners were the one thing I had never been able to set down. Neva looked mildly surprised. She stepped back. Kale had not moved. He was watching me with that same expression from the great hall. That unreadable thing that was not coldness and not warmth, but something between them. Something I didn't have a name for. "Tell me what you saw," he said. So I told him, clearly, in order, without embellishment. The copper smell, the window, the half-second of stillness, the arrow's trajectory. I told him where I had been standing, where Caden had been sitting, what angle the arrows had come from based on where they struck the wall. I told him everything I had noticed in those few seconds with the particular precision of someone who had spent 3 years being invisible in rooms full of important conversations and had, apparently, absorbed more than anyone had intended. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Beta Orin was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the slightly recalibrated look of someone who has just moved you from one category to another in their internal accounting. Captain Neva had gone very still. And Kale had not moved at all, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted. He was not just watching me now. He was seeing me. And the difference between those two things was large enough to stand in. "You were not afraid," he said. It was not a question. "I was," I said. "I just moved before the fear finished arriving." Something crossed his face. It was brief, half a second, maybe less, but it was there. "How long have you worked in this keep?" 3 years, Your Majesty." "And before that?" I kept my voice steady. "My home pack, the Ashvale, dissolved. I came here after." "Ashvale." He said the name carefully, the way people say names of things that used to exist. "I remember that dissolution. It was not a peaceful one." "No," I said. "It was not." Another silence. This one felt different, less formal. More like the silences that happen between people rather than between positions. "What is your name?" he asked. I blinked. After everything. After the hall, the arrows, Aldrich, the study, Neva's efficient hands and Orin's reassessment. After all of it, this was the question that nearly undid me. Because he was the king, and I had been in his keep for 3 years, and he did not know my name. Of course he didn't. I was a waitress. I was the water through the cracks. "Ivy," I said. He repeated it quietly, almost to himself. Just the word. Just the one syllable. Like he was placing it somewhere. "My son is unhurt because of you," Kale said then, and his voice had shifted. Still controlled, still measured, but something underneath it had changed register. something lower, something that felt more like the man than the king. I do not take that lightly. He was afraid, I said. I just wanted him to feel less alone in it. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain was still falling, loud and steady against the stone walls. Oren cleared his throat quietly and looked at the map as though he had suddenly found it very interesting. Neva gazed at the ceiling. Kyle looked at me for a long moment. You will be moved to the inner staff quarters tonight, he said. Until we understand who was responsible for what happened, I want everyone present in that hall accounted for and close. That includes you. I nodded. There was no room to argue, and I found, to my own surprise, that I did not particularly want to. Aldrich will see to it, he said, and then, after the briefest pause, so brief I almost missed it. Thank you, Ivy. My name in his mouth a second time. Steadier this time. Intentional. I dipped my head, not quite a bow, not quite not one, and let Aldrich lead me out. In the corridor, with the door closed behind me, and the lamplight steady, and the rain loud on the windows, I stood still for exactly 5 seconds and let myself shake. Then I straightened my spine, pushed the loose strand of blonde hair away from my face, and followed Aldrich down the corridor toward whatever came next. I had no way of knowing in that moment that the investigation would change everything, that it would take me out of the shadows I had spent 3 years building and place me, blinking, into a light I didn't know how to stand in yet, that in less than 2 weeks, I would learn something about those arrows that would make the night they fell seem simple by comparison. The inner staff quarters were nothing like the rooms I had shared with Sarah in the eastern wing. They were quieter, for one thing. The eastern wing had the particular ambient noise of a place where many people lived in close proximity. Footsteps through thin walls, voices carrying down stone corridors, the early morning clatter of the kitchen 2 floors below that functioned as an unwanted alarm for everyone above it. I had grown used to that noise the way you grow used to a river near your window. Present, constant, eventually a kind of comfort. The inner quarters were still, not empty. There were other people housed here. Members of the senior household staff and 2 of the king's personal attendants. But the walls were thicker, and the corridor narrower, and at night the silence pressed in close enough that I could hear my own thoughts with uncomfortable clarity. Sarah came to see me the morning after the feast, slipping through the corridor door with a cloth-covered plate and the expression of someone who had been awake most of the night. "You are the only person I know," she said, setting the plate on the small table near the window, "who could throw themselves in front of arrows and end up promoted." "I wasn't promoted," I said. "I was relocated. There's a difference." "Is there?" She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at me carefully. "Ivy, people are talking. People are always talking. About you, specifically. The Alpha Council representatives who were at the feast. 3 of them have already made formal inquiries about the incident. Not about who fired the arrows, about you. About the waitress who covered the prints." She paused. "Lady Vessa of the Ashvin asked Aldrich for your full name this morning." Something cold moved through me. "Why?" Sarah's expression answered before she did. "That is the part that worries me." The investigation moved quickly, the way things move when a king is involved and patience is not an option. Captain Neva led it, with Beta Oren coordinating the territorial intelligence, a quiet, methodical process that I watched from the edges, the way I watched most things. 3 of the feast's attending staff were questioned. 2 of the outer guard rotations were suspended pending review. The shattered eastern window was examined by Neva herself, who spent an hour up on the exterior scaffolding in the cold morning rain, without apparent complaint. I was questioned twice more. Once by Oren, in a small room off the inner corridor, with a scribe in the corner, and questions that circled the same territory as Kale's, but from different angles. Testing for consistency, I understood. The way you test a structure by pressing on it from multiple sides. I gave the same answers I had given the king, in the same order, because they were the truth, and the truth does not need to be remembered, only told. The second time, I was questioned by Neva alone. Neva was not what I had expected, up close. From a distance, she was simply formidable. That straight posture, that carefully neutral face, those watchful dark eyes that seemed to record everything without reacting to any of it. Up close, she was still all of those things. But she was also, I realized, deeply tired. Not the tiredness of one bad night, but the tiredness of someone who had been responsible for something precious for a very long time and took that responsibility in the way certain people do. Not lightly, not loudly, but in the bones. "You noticed the angle of the arrows," she said. "It was our third time over this particular piece of territory." "Yes. How?" "I looked at where they landed," I said. "The wall behind the staircase runs northeast-southwest. The arrows struck at a leftward slant, which means they came from the right of the window. From the northeast, which is the direction of the northern ridge. Not from directly outside the window." Neva was quiet for a moment. That is a specific observation for someone who had approximately 2 seconds. "I had 5, I said. "From the window breaking to when I covered him," I counted. She looked at me for a long, assessing moment. Then she made a note on the parchment in front of her and said, "You are not what I expected." "No one ever is," I said. "That's usually how it works." Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. It was gone quickly, but I caught it. It was on the 4th day that I saw Caden again. I had been given a task, a real one, not a reassignment back to the Great Hall, but something in between, a kind of deliberate occupation while the investigation continued. Aldrich had set me to work organizing the map room, which had apparently been in a state of managed chaos for the better part of a year, and which no one had tackled because it required both patience and the ability to read the territorial notations in the old pack script, which fewer people could do than you might expect. I could do it. My mother had taught me the old script when I was young, in the Ashvale pack, before everything fell apart. She had believed in useful knowledge with a quiet ferocity that I had inherited without quite realizing it. I was cross-referencing a border map from the Eastern Territories against a newer survey document when the door opened, and Caden walked in. He stopped when he saw me. Then he came the rest of the way in and closed the door behind him, with the careful deliberateness of a child who has practiced looking casual. "Aldrich said you were in here," he said. Aldrich was right. He looked around the room, at the maps sorted into careful stacks, the territorial scrolls rolled and tied, the reference documents arranged in a line along the table's edge. "You're organizing all of this?" "Trying to." He drifted closer, the way children drift toward things they're curious about. Not directly, but in a slow orbit that closes without admitting it's closing. He looked at the map I was working on. His eyes, sharp and quick the way his father's were sharp and quick, moved across it with what I recognized as genuine interest. "That's the eastern border," he said. "Past the Greywood." "Yes. Someone has been marking pack movements in this region for the last decade." I showed him the notation system, small symbols in the old script, patient and precise, accumulated over years. "Do you read the old script?" "Some," he said, a little defensively. "Father is teaching me." "It's useful," I said, "which was not your father is teaching you well and not you're doing a good job." Both of which he would have received before and which carried the faint condescension of adult approval. It was just the truth, stated plainly. He seemed to hear the difference. He sat down on the stool across the table from me, uninvited and completely at home, and looked at the map with that same restless intelligence I had noticed on the staircase. I let him be quiet. Some children need to fill silence, and some children need you to be comfortable in it with them. Caden, I was learning, was the second kind. "I didn't say thank you," he said after a few minutes. I kept my eyes on the map. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He said it with the particular firmness of someone who has been thinking about this for several days. "I want to. There's a difference." I looked up at him then. He was watching me with his gray-blue eyes, very serious, very young, very determined. "You're welcome, Caden," I said. He nodded once, satisfied, and went back to looking at the map. We worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour. Him asking questions about the territories in the old script, me answering them, both of us in the particular easy rhythm that sometimes happens between two people who are not trying to be anything to each other except present. It was the most comfortable I had felt since the night of the feast. When Aldrich came to collect him for his afternoon lessons, Caden went without argument, which I suspected was unusual. At the door, he paused. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Probably," I said. "There are still 300 maps." He almost smiled. "Good." It was that evening, when the keep had settled into its nighttime quiet, and I was returning to my quarters from the kitchens with a cup of tea I had made myself, because sleep felt distant and unhelpful, that I saw Cale. He was in the corridor outside the map room. Not pacing, he was not a man who paced, I was already learning, but standing at the window at the corridor's end, looking out at the dark with his hands clasped behind his back, and his shoulders carrying the specific weight of someone who was thinking about something they could not put down. I should have slipped past. The corridor was wide enough. He was facing away. I could have been a shadow. Instead, I stopped. I do not entirely know why, only that he looked, in that moment, not like a king with guards and maps, and the weight of 3 territories on his decisions, but like someone standing alone in the dark, the same way I had stood alone in a great many darks, and recognizing that in another person does something to your feet. It roots them. He heard me. Of course he did. He was an alpha king, and his hearing was nothing like mine. He turned. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The lamplight between us was thin and gold. "You couldn't sleep either," I said. It was not a question, and the moment it left my mouth, I heard how it sounded. Familiar, almost, and felt heat rise in my face. But Cale only looked at me for a moment and then said quietly, "No." "The investigation?" I said. "Partly." He turned back to the window. Then, after a pause that felt like a door being considered, "Oren believes it was coordinated. Someone inside the keep gave information about Caden's location." The cold moved through me again. "A traitor. Someone who wants me to believe the threat came from outside when it came from within." His voice was measured, but underneath the measure was something controlled only by effort. My son was sitting on that staircase because I told him to wait there, because I told him that particular corner was safe. The weight of that sentence settled in the room like something physical. I understood then what was underneath the stillness he had been carrying all week. Not just the threat. The knowledge that the threat had reached something he had tried to protect and had gotten close enough to matter, and had done so using his own words as a map. "He's safe," I said. "He is safe, right now. Because of you." He said it directly, without the formal distance of the king. "Thanks you." Just the plain fact, stated plainly, the way I had spoken to Caden about the old script. A waitress I didn't know the name of. The words were not unkind. They were something else, honest, a little raw. The kind of thing you say when you have been turning a thought over long enough that the polish has worn off, and you're left with the actual shape of it. "You know my name now," I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. The way he had in the great hall and in the study. That full, undivided attention that felt like being seen by something that did not look away from difficult things. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." The lamplight moved. Somewhere in the keep, a door closed. I said goodnight and walked to my quarters, and I did not look back, and I was very careful about that. But I heard him just before I turned the corner. A soft exhale, barely sound at all, the kind a person makes when they have been holding something in for a long time. I carried it with me into sleep. The traitor had a name by the 7th day. I learned it the way I learned most things in Ironvale Keep. Not by being told, but by being present in rooms where people forgot to be careful. I was in the map room when Oren came to speak with Aldrich in the corridor outside. Their voices low but not low enough, and I heard the name like a stone dropped into still water. Fenwick, one of the senior council attendants. A wolf who had served the keep for 11 years and who had, according to what I pieced together from Oren's clipped, controlled sentences, been passing information to someone outside the territory for at least 3 of them. Fenwick. I knew his face. A quiet man, unremarkable, the kind of person who existed at the edges of rooms. I understood that quality better than most. I sat very still with a territorial survey in my hands and did not move until their voices faded down the corridor. Then I set the survey down and stared at the map in front of me. The eastern border, the gray wood, the ridge from which the arrows had come, and let myself understand what this meant. Someone outside the territory had ordered those arrows. Someone who knew enough about Kale's movements, about Caden's habits, about the layout of the Great Hall, and the position of the back staircase, to aim at a specific child in a specific corner, at a specific moment. And someone inside the keep had given them everything they needed to do it. The Feast of the Blood Moon Accord, the most important political gathering in 2 decades. Every Pack Alpha, within 3 territories gathered in one room. What better moment to send a message to a king? Lady Vessa of the Ashven requested a formal audience with King Kale on the 8th day. I knew because Aldrich told me. Not directly, but in the way he had begun telling me things, which was by speaking near me with the mild and slightly deliberate air of a man who had decided, for his own reasons, that I was a useful person to keep informed. Aldrich was more perceptive than he appeared, which was saying something because he appeared quite perceptive already. The Lady Ashven has also requested that the inner household staff be present during the audience, he said, adjusting a stack of correspondence on the outer corridor table while I passed with a pile of sorted maps. As witnesses to protocol. I stopped. That's unusual. It is. He did not look up from the correspondence. You will be among those present. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Then, Aldrich, why? He did look up then, briefly, because the king requested it. The audience chamber was smaller than the Great Hall, but no less weighted. Dark stone walls, high windows, a long table at which Kale sat at the head with Oren to his right, and Neva standing at his left shoulder like a shadow with opinions. 3 of the remaining Alpha Council representatives were present, Alpha Drev among them, his broad face carefully arranged into an expression of neutral attention that did not entirely conceal the calculation underneath. Lady Vessa sat across the table from Kale, and she was, I thought, the most dangerous kind of person, one who understood that composure was its own weapon. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from absolute self-discipline. Her eyes, when they moved to me as I took my place with the 2 other inner staff members along the left wall, were the cool, assessing gray of winter water. She looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Those 3 seconds told me everything I needed to know about why she had asked me to be here, and none of it was good. Your Majesty, she began, her voice smooth and measured, and carrying the particular cadence of someone who had prepared this speech with great care. The events of the Blood Moon Accord have left the Allied packs deeply concerned. An attack on the Prince, within the walls of Iron Vale itself, raises significant questions about the security and stability of the Central Authority. Kyle said nothing. He listened with that absolute stillness of his, and I had learned enough about him in 8 days to understand that his silence was not passivity. It was the stillness of something that had chosen, for now, not to move. Questions, Vessa continued, that the Allied Council feels must be addressed with transparency, including, and here her gaze moved, briefly and deliberately back to me. Questions about the role of certain individuals in the events of that evening. The room shifted. Not physically, no one moved, but something in the air changed. The individual in question, Vessa said, is a former member of the Ashvale Pack, a pack that dissolved under contested circumstances, whose dissolution, I would remind this council, involved allegations of unauthorized alliance negotiations with territories outside our borders. The words landed like the arrows had, fast, aimed, precise. I stood very still against the wall. My hands were clasped in front of me. My face, I hoped, was giving nothing away. "You are suggesting," Cale said. His first words, and they were quiet enough that the room contracted to hear them. That the waitress who shielded my son with her own body was part of the plot against him. Vessa's expression did not change. "I am suggesting that her presence in that specific location, at that specific moment, merits examination. That her background deserves scrutiny. That in a matter this serious, sentiment should not cloud judgment." Sentiment. The word chosen deliberately, designed to imply that Cale's attention toward me was personal, was clouded, was a weakness being exploited. Alpha Drev shifted in his seat. One of the other representatives, a younger alpha named Roth, from the northern Crestfall pack, was looking at the table with an expression I couldn't read. Orin spoke for the first time. "The investigation has produced a confirmed suspect in the attack, my lady. A member of the Keep's own council staff. That investigation is ongoing." "Then it should extend in all directions," Vessa said smoothly, "including the direction of anyone who was conveniently positioned to appear heroic." The room was quiet. I looked at Cale. He was not looking at me. He was looking at Vessa, and his face was very still. And I understood, in the way I understood things before their moment arrived, that he was making a decision. Not about Vessa. Not even entirely about me. About something larger than both of us. About what kind of king he was in this room, right now, when being watched by people who were waiting to see if he could be moved by pressure or fear. "Ivy," he said. Every head turned, mine included. "Tell the council what you observed on the night of the feast. In your own words. From the beginning." I felt the weight of the room settle onto me like weather. Vessa's cool gaze. Drev's assessing one. Roth, still looking at the table. Neva at the king's shoulder, watchful. Orin with his hands flat on the table and his expression carefully composed. And Cale, at the head of it, watching me with that particular quality of attention that did not flinch, and did not hurry, and did not tell me what to say. So I spoke. I told it the way I had told it twice before. Clearly, in order, without embellishment. But this time I told it in a room where people were listening not to understand, but to find the crack in it, and that changed the telling slightly, the way wind changes the way a candle burns. I was more precise. I was more specific. I included details I had held back in the earlier questionings because they had not been asked, the particular sound of the arrows before they struck, which told me their weight, and therefore their range, and therefore, roughly, the distance from which they had been fired. The way Caden had been sitting, turned slightly inward toward the tapestry, which meant that from outside the window, he would have been partially obscured unless the shooter had inside information about exactly where to aim. When I finished, the room was quiet again. Roth, the young Northern Alpha, was no longer looking at the table. "The shooter needed interior knowledge to make that shot," he said slowly. "Partial window, low light, a child tucked behind a tapestry. Someone told them exactly where to look." "Yes," I said, "which is why I am not the person in this room you should be concerned about." I had not planned to say it. It arrived fully formed, and I let it go. And for one suspended second, I was not certain if I had just made a catastrophic error. Then Alpha Drev exhaled, a short sound, something between a grunt and a reluctant concession, and sat back in his chair. Vessa looked at me with those winter water eyes, and what was in them now was not calculation. It was something harder and less comfortable. The look of someone who has made a move and watched it not land the way they intended. "The investigation," Cale said, and his voice had returned to that measured, absolute quality that closed doors without touching them, "is Captain Neva's domain. It will continue without political interference. The Allied Council's concerns about security are noted, and will be addressed through the proper channels." He paused. "This audience is concluded." People rose. The room began to empty. I stayed against the wall because no one had told me otherwise, and because my legs needed another moment to be certain of themselves. Vesa passed me on the way to the door. She did not stop, but she looked at me. One long, level look that said, without words, "This is not finished." I met her eyes and held them until she looked away first. When the room had nearly emptied, I became aware that Kale had not moved from his chair, and that Oren and Neva had, with the quiet efficiency of people who understood their king's silences, made themselves busy at the far end of the room. I walked to the table. I did not sit. That would have been too much, but I stopped at the corner nearest him and waited. "She will try again," he said. "Not Vesa, just she. Like naming the shape of a problem rather than the problem itself." "I know," I said. "She has allies on the council. People who are not certain the center holds." He said it with the evenness of someone stating a fact they have made peace with, but his jaw was doing the thing I had noticed it doing when something cost him more than he showed. "She wants me uncertain, divided, watching the wrong direction." "It's a reasonable strategy," I said. "If your enemy is stronger, make them smaller by making them doubt themselves." He looked at me then, and something in his expression shifted. Not the controlled shift of a king managing a room, but something involuntary. Something that happened before he could decide whether to let it happen. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. "Invisible people learn to understand power," I said, "because we have none of it. We have to know how it moves." The fire in the side hearth popped. Outside, the afternoon light was fading into the gray gold of early evening. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear Caden's voice, carrying some question to Aldrich, animated, the way he got when something interested him. Kale heard it too. Something in his face changed at the sound. Not softened, exactly, because Kale was not a man who softened, but relieved, in the deep and private way of relief that has nowhere to put itself. "He has been going to the map room every day," Kyle said. "Yes." "He does not do that with people he does not trust." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not have been either too much or too little. "Ivy." My name again, in that same register. Not the king's voice, but the man's. Whatever Vesa implied in that room, I want you to know that I do not. "You don't have to," I said quietly. "I know." He stopped. We looked at each other across the corner of the table, in the fading afternoon light, with the sound of his son's voice carrying down the corridor between us. And for the first time since the arrows fell, something in Kale's face let go. Just slightly, just for a moment. But it was real. And I saw it. And I understood that being seen seeing it meant something neither of us was ready to say aloud yet. I dipped my head and left the room. In the corridor, I passed Caden going the other direction. He held up one hand in the same small wave I had given him the night of the feast. "It's all right." I smiled. And meant it. 3 weeks after the arrows fell, the truth came apart at the seams. And it did so, as truth often does, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a single quiet thread being pulled. Neva found it. She came to the map room on a Tuesday morning, when the light through the high windows was pale and thin, and the keep smelled of wood smoke, and the first real cold of the season pressing in from the north. I was cross-referencing survey documents, a task I had come to find genuinely absorbing, the way you find absorbing anything that requires precise attention and rewards patience. When she walked in without knocking and set a folded piece of parchment on the table in front of me. "Look at the seal," she said. I looked. The wax seal on the folded parchment was broken, but its impression was still visible. A stylized bird in profile, wings folded, head angled down. Not a wolf. Not any pack symbol I recognized from the territorial maps. "Ashfin," I said slowly. Then, looking more carefully at the bird's angle. but not the primary Ashfin seal. This is a secondary mark, a personal one. Neva was very still. How do you know that? Because I grew up near the Ashfin border, I said. The primary seal has the bird's wings spread. Folded wings are a personal correspondence mark. Old custom. Lady Vessa's family has used it for 4 generations. Neva sat down across from me. It was the first time I had seen her sit in our many conversations, and the fact of it made the moment feel significant. This was found in Fenwick's quarters, she said. Hidden inside the binding of a record book. He did not write it. It was written to him. Instructions for the night of the feast. Positioning. Timing. The location of the back staircase. She paused. And a name. Caden, I said. And a reason. Her voice was level, precise, the voice of someone delivering information they have been carrying for hours and need to set down. If the prince is harmed during a gathering of all allied alphas, the resulting instability removes Kale's authority to hold the central territory. The allied council fragments. Individual alphas claim portions of the disputed borderlands. Ashfin, positioned at the eastern edge, takes the largest share. The map in front of me, the Eastern Border Survey, the one I had been working on for 3 weeks, the one Caden and I had bent over together while he learned the old script, looked different now. Not like a record of territory, like a plan. She has been building toward this for years, I said. At least 4, Neva confirmed. Fenwick has been in her correspondence since before the last accord. I sat with that for a moment. 4 years of patience, 4 years of small movements, quiet influence, a web built thread by thread in the dark, while the keep went about its days above it. Does the king know? I asked. He will in approximately 20 minutes, Neva said. I came to you first. I looked at her. Why? She met my eyes with that direct, measuring gaze that gave nothing away except occasionally, everything. Because you will be in that room, she said simply, and I wanted you to know the shape of it before you walked in. The room was the study, the same one I had stood in the night of the feast, with the fire and the maps and the bookshelves packed with cracked spines. But it was fuller now. Oren, Neva, Aldrich at the far wall. 2 of the senior council members Kyle trusted. Older wolves, careful men, who had served Ironvale for decades, and whose faces, when Neva laid the parchment on the table, went through a sequence of expressions that ended, in both cases, at something that looked like grief. Kale read the document once. Then he set it down and was quiet for a long moment. I watched him from my place near the door, still the edge of the room, still the wall. But a different kind of edge now. Not invisible. Present. Fenwick has confirmed this? Kale said. Under formal questioning this morning, Neva said. Yes. And Vessa is still within the territory? She has not yet departed from the guest quarters. She was planning to leave tomorrow. Kyle nodded once. His face was doing none of the things it might have been expected to do. Not fury. Not the cold, theatrical anger of a king managing optics. He looked instead like someone who had been carrying a suspicion for a long time and had just been given the weight of the proof, and was now deciding what to do with the full burden of knowing for certain. We bring it before the full Allied Council, he said. All representatives present, Vessa among them. He paused. Publicly. Oren made a small sound. Not disagreement, but consideration. That will be difficult to contain. The implications for Ashfin, for the Allied structure. The implications for the Allied structure, Kyle said quietly, are exactly why it must be public. Because if I resolve this in private, the question will always exist. Whether I bent it, whether I shaped the truth to protect my own position. He looked at the parchment. I will not govern on the basis of convenient silence. The room was still. Then Aldrich, from his place at the far wall, quiet, perceptive Aldrich, who had been in this keep longer than anyone, said, No, you never have. The full Allied Council assembled the following morning in the Great Hall. The same hall with the repaired eastern window, and the stone wall where 3 arrow marks had been filled with mortar and smoothed over, present still if you knew where to look. I stood with the inner household staff along the left wall, in the same place I had stood 100 times before, in the same gray dress with my blonde braid over one shoulder, and watched. Cale presented the evidence himself, not through Neva, not through Oren, but himself, standing at the head of the long table with the parchment and Neva's full investigation record laid out before the assembled alphas, and speaking with the same plainness he had used in private. No performance, no thunder. Just the shape of what had happened, laid out in the clear, unsentimental language of someone who respected his audience, enough not to dress the truth in anything other than itself. Lady Vessa sat at the table and did not speak for a long time. When she did speak, it was not a denial. I had wondered about that, had thought she might argue, deflect, construct an alternative account with the same precision she had brought to everything else. But she did not. She looked at the parchment with her winter-water eyes, and she said very quietly, "I believed the territory would be stronger fragmented than it is whole." "You were wrong," Alpha Roth said. He was the youngest Alpha at the table, the one from Crestfall who had spoken up in the private audience, and he said it without anger. Just the flat, certain weight of someone who has made up his mind. Drev said nothing, but he moved the water cup in front of him a precise half-inch to the left, which I had learned in 3 weeks of watching him, was what he did when he had reached a conclusion he did not like, but could not argue with. The formal proceedings took the rest of the morning. Vessa's authority over Ashfen was suspended pending a full territorial review. 2 of her allied representatives were removed from the council pending their own investigations. The allied pack structure held, shaken, newly aware of its own fault lines, but intact. At noon, when the council adjourned and the great hall began to empty, Cale did not move immediately from his place at the head of the table, and neither did I, from mine at the wall. The hall emptied around us until there was only Oren, gathering documents with practiced efficiency, and Neva at the door, and the 2 of us, the king at the table's head and the waitress at the wall, in the amber and shadow of the hall where 3 weeks ago arrows had fallen like rain, and everything had changed. Oren glanced up, glanced between us, and said something quiet to Neva. They moved to the antechamber, and let the door rest almost closed behind them. Kyle rose from his chair and walked the length of the hall toward me. Not hurrying, not performing, just walking, the way he did everything, deliberately, with his full attention already on where he was going. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me with those gray-blue eyes that I had spent 3 weeks learning the language of. "It's over," I said. "The immediate threat," he agreed. "The rest," he paused. "The rest will take time. It always does." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up from the north, rattling the repaired window in its frame. The fire in the side hearth had burned low. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you told me, about invisible people understanding power because they have none of it." I waited. "I have spent 15 years governing this territory," he said. "I have sat in that chair and read maps and managed councils and made decisions I believed were the right ones. And I did not know the name of the woman who had worked in my household for 3 years. He said it with the evenness of someone making an honest accounting, not self-flagellation, just the plain fact of a thing. I would like to not make that kind of mistake again. It's a common mistake, I said, among people who hold power. I know. That is not an excuse. He paused. I am not asking you to forgive the oversight. Then what are you asking? He looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment I saw all of it, the whole 3 weeks compressed, the study, the corridor window, the map room, the audience chamber, Caden's small wave, the way Cale's face had looked the night I found him standing alone in the dark, the way it looked now, open, for a man who opened very rarely, and very carefully, and only when he had decided the risk was worth the cost. I am asking, he said quietly, If you would be willing to stay. Not as a waitress. Not as inner staff. He paused. Near. As someone whose counsel I find I cannot easily do without. The word counsel was chosen carefully. I understood that. There were things between us that neither of us had named yet, and he was not naming them now. Not in this hall, not today. He was moving slowly, the way the most deliberate things move, with the understanding that slow is not the same as uncertain. I am already near, I said. I have been near for 3 weeks. I know. Something in his expression shifted. That involuntary thing. The one that happened before he could decide. I would like it to be a choice. Yours. Not a circumstance. I looked at him. At this man who had spent 15 years being powerful and lonely, in the particular way that powerful people are lonely. Surrounded and unseen, in the same way I had been unseen, just from the opposite direction, who had a son with sharp eyes and a restless mind who went to the map room every day and was learning the old script and had said, I want to. There's a difference. Who had stood at a window in the dark and exhaled like a man setting something down. Then yes, I said, it's a choice. He held my gaze for one more moment. And then something shifted in his face, quietly, completely, the way long-held things shift when they are finally allowed to. And he nodded. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a declaration in front of the council, or a gesture that would be recorded and retold. It was just 2 people in an emptying hall, in the amber light, having agreed to something real. The weeks that followed were different. Caden finished learning the Eastern Territorial script and began, on his own initiative, cross-referencing the border maps against the old survey records, a project of genuine analytical value that Oren adopted into the official record with the mildly stunned expression of someone who had not expected to be outpaced by a 9-year-old. He began leaving me notes in the old script, tucked between map pages, which were technically just questions about notation systems, and which were also, unmistakably, conversation. Neva and I developed an understanding. Not a friendship exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, built on mutual respect and a shared tendency toward precision. She began including me in the morning security briefings, not as staff, but as someone whose observational instincts she had decided were worth having in the room. I learned things about the keep's security I had never known. She learned, I think, that having an extra pair of eyes that no one noticed was worth more than most people assumed. Fenwick was tried before the Allied Council and removed from the keep. The Ashfin territory underwent its review, and a younger member of the Ashfin Council, a woman named Dara, quiet and careful and nothing like Vesa, was appointed to lead the pack's realignment. The Allied structure held. Not perfectly, not without ongoing difficulty and the long, careful work of rebuilt trust. But it held. Oren stopped treating me like a phenomenon to be studied and started treating me like a colleague, which expressed itself primarily as him arguing with me about territorial history during the morning briefings, which I took as the warmest possible form of acceptance from a man who argued with people he respected and ignored the rest. Alpha Drev, when his delegation departed 2 weeks after the council proceedings, stopped on his way through the outer courtyard and looked at me for a long moment. Ashvale Pack, he said. Yes. Good roots, he said. Strong ones. And walked on. It was on a quiet evening in late autumn, the fire high, the wind loud outside, the keep settled into its nighttime sounds, that Cale found me in the map room for the first time. Not Caden this time. Him. He looked at the organized shelves, the sorted surveys, the 300 maps now cross-referenced and cataloged in the old script. And then he looked at me with an expression I had come to know well by then. The one that arrived before he decided to let it. He sat down across the table, in the same place Caden always sat. We talked for 2 hours, about the Eastern Territories and the pack history embedded in the old maps, about the Ashvale dissolution and what I had seen in its last months. Information that turned out to be genuinely useful for understanding certain long-running territorial disputes. About Caden, who was reading ahead in his lessons and driving his tutor to productive desperation. About small things, eventually. the way the northern cold came in differently through the repaired window, the particular satisfaction of a well-organized archive. At some point the fire burned low, and neither of us moved to add wood, and the room grew warm and dim, and the wind outside did what wind does when the rest of the world is quiet. It made everything feel contained, a little separate from the larger noise of things. "You are not what I expected," he said. The same words Neva had used. A different weight. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would need something from me," he said. "Everyone in these rooms needs something. Position, favor, proximity to power. It is the nature of the place." He looked at me steadily. "You never seemed to need any of it." "I needed somewhere to belong," I said. "That's different from needing power." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said softly, "it is." He reached across the corner of the table and placed his hand over mine, briefly, carefully, the gesture of a man who does not make gestures carelessly. His hand was warm and certain, and when I turned mine over slightly to meet it, neither of us said anything at all. We did not need to. 3 weeks of corridors and silences, and a hall full of arrows, and one long, quiet autumn had already set it. The Blood Moon Accord was formally renewed before the first snowfall. All Allied Alphas signed. The Central Authority held. The borderlands were quiet for the first time in years. On the morning the last delegation departed, Caden came to find me in the map room and sat on his stool and said, without preamble, "Are you going to stay?" "Yes," I said. He nodded, satisfied, the same single nod his father used when he had received information he considered correct and complete. "Good," he said, and pulled a map toward himself and began to work. That winter, I was given a formal role in the keep, archivist and territorial council, working alongside Orin in the mornings and maintaining the map room in the afternoons. It was not a title anyone had held before. Aldrich wrote it into the household record with the careful handwriting of a man who knew he was writing something that would be read later by people who would want to know how it had begun. I read my name in that record once, in the quiet of an afternoon when the keep was still, Ivy of Ashvale, counsel to the crown, and I stood with it for a long moment. Not invisible, not the water through the cracks. Present. Chosen. Kyle and I walked the eastern ramparts together that first snowfall. The keep below us, the territory spread white and still and vast in every direction. The Allied packs settled into their lands, the long work of peace continuing in its slow and necessary way. His shoulder was warm against mine. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He did not say "I love you" that day. He said it later, in the map room, on an ordinary evening. In the plain and deliberate way he said everything that mattered to him. Without ceremony, without distance, just the words, given directly, the way he had learned to give things, fully, once he had decided. I said it back. Equally plainly. Equally certain. Caden, who was pretending to read a survey document on the other side of the table, made no sound. But when I glanced at him, he was smiling at the parchment, with the specific private smile of someone who has known something for a long time, and is very pleased to have been right about it. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside. The maps on the walls recorded every territory, every border, every place where something had been built, and something had been lost, and something, eventually, had been found again. I was not the water through the cracks anymore. I was the one who had learned to read the cracks, and had stayed, and had chosen, and had built something real in a place that had once barely known my name. And that, in the end, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.